Welcome to Using Innovative Practices to Reimagine Learning, lessons from 3 districts. This session will feature educators from Belvidere, Kankakee, and Round Lake area schools sharing their journeys, challenges, and lessons as they work to remove barriers for all students in their communities using innovative practices to focus on learning. So we'd like this to be an informal discussion session, and we hope to build connections. So please turn on your camera if possible. Also, feel free to unmute yourself for comments and questions. There'll be specific times along the way, but really any time. And I'll monitor the chat, so please feel free to use it as well. We would like to know who is here. So if I'm not taxing my technological capacity too much, here is a poll. Please let us know your role. In a minute or two, I will let you know what this looks like. Okay, great. So it looks like we have a majority of administrators, some education community members, and a few teachers. Thanks for joining us. So let's get started. First off, we'll hear from Dr. David Carson, who serves as the Assistant Superintendent for the Belvidere School District. He's held this position for 6 years and is responsible for supporting and coordinating continuous improvement efforts aligned to the district's strategic plan. He serves in the lead role for the district's efforts to shift to a competency-based education model, its one-to-one technology implementation, and supporting secondary school principals. 2 of his proudest professional accomplishments were to earn recognition as a National Board Certified Teacher in 2006 and to be named the Exemplary Educator by the National Career Academy Coalition in 2014. Dave, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Ginger. Good morning, everyone. Ginger already explained who I am, and so I work in the Belvidere School District, which is in northern Illinois, right along I-90 next to Rockford, just south of the Wisconsin border. We have about 7,500 students that attend 11 different schools. We have 6 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, 2 traditional high schools, and 1 alternative campus. In terms of breakdown of our students, we have about half our students qualify for free reduced lunch, and then we have about a 60-40 split, 60% being white and 40% being Hispanic or Latino, and then some other small minority groups. So just to give you a sense of the Belvidere School District, where we're at and who we serve. If you go to the next slide, please, Ginger. Should go 1 back, I think. Maybe.
Sorry, I'll get there.
That's right. So our school district, we worked on a strategic planning process 6 years ago and identified that we wanted to transition to the other way, Ginger, a student-centered learning environment that is identified by this model, thank you, Ginger, that it is personalized, it's technology enhanced, it's student-owned, and it's proficiency-based. And at the same time that we were working on developing the strategic plan and putting together our goals and action plans, was the same time that the state approved the POWER Act, in which that created the competency-based ed pilot at the state level. And we saw that as a real opportunity to connect with others and with the state framework that really connected with that proficiency-based component of our student-centered learning model. If you go to the next one, please, Ginger. So the other kind of historical context that is really useful to understand about our Belvidere School District is that we had been working with Marzano Research on developing scales as far back as about 10 or 11 years ago. And about 7 years ago, they adopted the High Reliability Schools framework that's outlined here on the screen for you. And the reason why I'm sharing this is not to pitch Marzano Resources, but again, to give some context for our work. And so we had schools working in levels 1, 2, and 3, which is really what makes a high reliable school. And we're working towards this student-centered learning model and recognize that this school improvement framework had a plan and had steps, had indicators to follow to help us get to that competency-based system at level 5. And so as we made a decision about how to progress to that future state that we desired, we had to have some conversation of, were we going to work through level 4, a standards reference reporting system, to get to level 5, or were we going to jump to level 5 and figure out level 4 along the way? And so we made the decision that we would start by transitioning to level 4, which is the work I'm going to describe for you here in a minute, which means that we're giving students feedback based on standards using scale scores in all of our classes in order to get us to a position where we can provide students the opportunity to move on when they're ready based on their demonstrated proficiency, which that's the difference in a level 5 system from a level 4 system. So in level 4, teachers still dictate the pace at which students progress through standards largely, whereas in level 5, that's much more student-owned and student-driven. So if you go on the next slide. So we put together a timeline for our rollout of what we call PBG, proficiency-based grading. We started in our elementary schools, what is now 4 years ago. They shifted to all of their feedback to students being given by standard using scale scores. At that same time, we also had middle school and high school teachers begin to pilot the use of standards-based grading or proficiency-based grading in their classrooms. And so we had several years of piloting amongst our high school teams. So 3 years ago, our middle school team transitioned to a proficiency-based reporting system. Then, as we all know, something happened in the spring of 2020 that caused lots of plans to be delayed. And so we held off a year on our high school implementation. And so this is our first year this year of implementing fully, where all of our teachers, all of our students in K through 12 are using scales and standards to understand their learning and their progress towards this prioritized standards. So there's lots of big questions that we had, good timing, Ginger, that we had to answer on this transition. And one of which is, we know we need to give students letter grades. Part of the pilot program provided us an opportunity to connect with admissions offices where they made it very clear that it's still necessary for students' post-secondary careers to get letter grades, traditional letter grades on their transcript. And so we had to make a decision about how we would translate scale scores to letter grades. And I just think this is useful for you to see as a model if this is something you're considering or just want to understand. And so this is what's referred to as a logic model. Another school district on the north side of Chicago uses a similar model. And it just looks at the preponderance of evidence of their scale scores. And so, for example, if I, as a student, had all 3s and 4s on all my standards for that class, that would mean I would get an A. Whereas if I have half or more 3s on my standards, no 1s, the rest are 2s, then I would have a B. You can read the rest. A really tough decision we had to make was, what does it take for a student to fail a class? And we put the bar pretty high that they cannot have a 1 on any of their prioritized standards. But this led to then us having this issue of, is the student failing the course, or do we need to provide them additional time? So kind of a toe into that level 5, that competency-based environment. So if you go to the next slide, Ginger. So this is what the report card looks like that our students are getting this year. On the left-hand column there, you see it lists each of the standards that they're working on in each course. That middle column, the teachers are able to identify what the expected level of performance is for students at that time. The far right hand shows what the student's score is at that time. And then that logic model I just walked you through is baked into the system, and then it produces a letter grade for the students, and it's calibrated based on what this teacher's expected score is. So if they're not expected to be at a 3 yet, it treats anything that's not a 3 yet like a 3, basically. So this is the report card that they're getting in our high schools and our middle schools, and we have a very similar report card we provide to our students in elementary school. If you can move on. So as I mentioned with the I, we recognized that now we know more about why students aren't passing a particular course. We can diagnose that it's a particular set of standards, or maybe even one standard in particular that they haven't yet demonstrated proficiency on. So instead of having them repeat the whole entire course, how do we provide them the opportunity to provide additional evidence of learning to show proficiency of those standards that they haven't yet mastered? So in that first year of piloting, we had a small group of teachers at one of our high schools that implemented a proficiency recovery model in the spring for some freshman students. And so they had the chance to address some of the standards that were taught during first semester that they didn't master or show progress towards during a spring class. And so a lot of times that replaced study hall, sometimes an elective class. And we had a lot of success with that. We also incorporated WIN, what I need, flex period during the day, where kids who even weren't in that proficiency recovery model could get additional time with teachers that they needed help from. So we expanded that model the following year to more students besides our freshmen. We had students from all grade levels. And then we also added in recovery for all. So after the fall semester, we had students who got an I for a course, and we provided them with 3 weeks of additional time to demonstrate proficiency for standards that they hadn't yet met to recover any failed course credit. last year, sorry, with the pandemic, we switched to a block schedule, and we were able to add in win period and win days. So we had all sorts of flex time for kids that students really valued. The win days that we added in were at the end of the semester. So typically when finals are given, we had the last 2-3 days of the semester where students can provide additional evidence of learning just for standards that they wanted to show additional evidence learning for, and no new learning took place. And so that's something that we were able to hang on to this year as we transition back to a normal 7-day period. And then we've also continued to offer that win time. What we learned though is early in the semester, when learning is new, kids are generally doing are fine with everything. There's not a big need for win, and that period becomes really loosey-goosey. And so we've held off on having that win period built in the schedule until we get a few weeks into the semester, in which time there's deficits are starting to show, kids need extra time. And so we make that available 2 days a week now, and we still are doing the win days at the end of the semester. And then with some of our ESSER funding, we've added after school tutoring time. It's also shifted how we do summer school. So now during summer school, instead of students having to repeat all of Algebra 1, we know that they're missing these 2 standards. And so during summer school, they can just focus their time and energy on additional learning and evidence of those standards in order to recover their credit, which means they do tend to get through more classes during summer school. So we went from having about 40 to 50 students each summer in summer school where they were doing traditional whole class credit recovery opportunities to this last summer we had over 300 students that recovered over 500 credits in our summer school, and we plan on doing that again this year. And this is pushing us all to have some big conversations. The block schedule we experienced last year gave folks a lot more focus in their day and some more flex time in their day. And that's something that people are really missing. Both teachers and students are sharing that they're missing that. And so that's something that we're talking about revisiting down the road here of our master schedule. So that's all the positive, the things that have been going great in Belvidere. So there is another side to the story. Last spring, we had board elections, and we had several new board members who took seats, and some of them campaigned on their goal of ending proficiency-based grading in our school system. And so they adjusted our school board policy to where each fall we have to present what our grading system is, and they get the chance to either thumbs up or thumbs down or approve that system. And so we put on the table our current system that we're using that I just described to you in November, and the board did not approve that for continued use into next year. So we're in the midst of working through developing a proposal for our school board to approve hopefully this month at our meeting on the 21st. And so I want to talk you through some of what's probably going to stick and what are some things that we see going away. So if you can hit the next slide, please, Ginger. So really a lot of the pain and frustration came around the use of scale scores, in particular in high school. There's just a lot of yearning for what's familiar and what's known, and the concerns about what's the transition look like for students as they go on to post-secondary. So we're expecting that we will be going back to a percentage-based system and converting percentages to letter grades. The learning management system, so we had partnered with a new learning management system that we piloted last year and went all in on this year. It was well designed. It's really well designed for a proficiency-based or a competency-based system. The challenge that we had is, that's complex and that's a big change for folks. But the other problem we had is that it was really unreliable. We still are having issues where the system bogs down and kids and teachers can't get into the system on too frequent of a basis. So that's definitely created a lot of backlash. And then the conversion chart. People felt that was confusing, not clear, and have had a real challenge with that. So given that we're going back to a percentage-based system, that conversion chart is not something we plan to hang on to going into next year. So what will persist is unknown at this time, again, until we get board approval in a few weeks here. I can't speak with certainty about anything, but what we are proposing is that we still give feedback to students where they know by standard how they're performing. So I am at a B on polynomials, whereas I have an A on quadratic equations. Reassessment, thankfully, is one of those things that, one of those practices that has really expanded and has gotten a lot of traction with teachers, parents, and students. They see the value in that. They recognize how that matches the learning process. And so we want to maintain reassessment. But we've also, some of the challenges that we've had is that there's the way that's been approached by some teachers is it seems to be that there's an endless number of opportunities for kids to reassess, and they're gaming the system, and it's creating a lot of additional work for teachers. And so we're working right now with our teacher teams and student feedback to come up with some parameters to tighten up reassessments so that we can maintain that and keep that as a part of our system. Win time, that flex time that I referred to, will continue to be part of our system. And like I said, we hope to have some conversations about how we can adjust our master schedule to further incorporate those. So the last slide I have for you, some uncertainties here. We're still trying to figure out. We recognize, I've met with some parent, student, and teacher teams, and there's a recognition like how we score by standard maybe should be different than how we average things together for an overall course grade. And so we're working through that. We started giving feedback on what we call habits of work. So like your teamwork, how self-directed you are, those non-academic factors. We've been giving feedback using scale scores. And so we're really wrestling with how do we most effectively do that in a percentage-based system without having that muddy the water again about their academic outcomes. And so in addition to having a new school board, we will also now have a new superintendent that will start this summer. And so I'm expecting that we'll be doing some strategic planning and revisiting what our vision is. And so whether or not we're going to continue to progress towards a competency-based system is a question that we'll be exploring and working through over the next few months. So hopefully our story is useful to you, and look forward to a conversation later.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Does anybody want to jump in with a question right now for Dave? I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the pushback about reassessment, and maybe say a little bit more about where that's coming from and what you make of it.
Sure. So one of the biggest pushback areas, well, it's a combo. It's kind of a dual side of the same coin here, is that there isn't enough accountability and sense of urgency that our system creates for kids. They just kind of wait. Some of them are gaming, of not taking the assessment perhaps, and just using it as a learning point as opposed to really working through that assessment. And then because of that, then there becomes this timelessness of I can wait for a month to reassess, which now is piling up work for the teacher as well for the student, right? Because the class has moved on with what their work is. And so asking the student to demonstrate proficiency on a standard that they struggled with 4 weeks ago while also staying on top of what their current work is can be really problematic. And so I think that's a very fair critique. And so, but the other side of that is that some of our teachers have really good structures in place. Just last night, I had to sign a form for my daughter to reassess, right? There's some expectation that she's doing additional work in order for her to be able to reassess. And so many of our teachers do have really good practices like that in place. We just need to make that more systemic.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much.
Sure.
I'll share my screen again. Oh, sorry, Don, did you want to say something? Okay. Sorry, it's hilarious that I am doing the technology because I couldn't be any worse at it.
You're doing a great job. You're doing great.
Let's see. How about that? Great. So now we'll hear from Kankakee. We'll hear from Dr. Genevra Walters, a superintendent, and Felice Hybert, Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction. Dr. Walters has a vision to develop an educational system that creates opportunities for all children to be valued, contributing citizens in a fast-changing global society. She's been Kankakee Superintendent since 2014 and has developed a K-5 career framework, designed a college career academy model, and set a vision to transform secondary education from a factory mindset to an inquiry-based model. She co-authored the book, What Works for Special Education and At-Risk Learners, a framework for general education teachers and administrators. And also we'll hear from Ms. Hybert, who's dedicated to providing visionary, engaging learning opportunities for students, families, and staff in the district, which serves 5,200 students in grades pre-K to 12. She has more than 25 years of experience in education, serving as a director of curriculum, principal, assistant principal, and classroom teacher in both special education and general education settings. Her signature always includes children first, which all her decisions are based on. So I will turn it over to the two of you.
Good morning. I'll start by giving a little demographics of our school district. In terms of of our student population, 48% of our students are African-American, 30% are Latino, Hispanic, or Hispanic, and 19% are white. Our low income rate is at 84%. One of the things that was important to me when I came back to, I actually am a resident of Kankakee, but came back as a employee of the district, is the fact that many of the people in many communities like ours have been here for generations. And the educational system really does have a direct impact on the community culture, on economic development. And so it was important to me to come in and start looking at the system as a pipeline to the workforce, and that we needed to really focus on what the local community wanted in terms of their future workforce. And so that's how we began to look at what we were doing as an educational system. Go to the next slide. So in 2014, we started talking about redesigning education for economic development. When we had the opportunity to participate in the competency-based pilot, in my mind, it actually aligned with the overall vision of the district. And so I did ask Ms. Hybert to figure out how we could begin transforming the high school from a traditional mindset of where we were then, about 5 years ago now, to where we are now. And we have a really long way to go, because this has been very difficult work. Next slide. So Felice, you want to talk about the slide?
Sure. So one of the things that we talked about was, like Dr. Walters said, kind of what was the vision post-secondary. So for so many years, high schools have kind of concentrated on the graduation rate, like making sure that kids are walking across the stage, getting a diploma, but we wanted to go further than that. Like what skills do our students, our children need in order to be successful post-secondary? And so that's really where we started planning backwards from. And so we really started to look at all of those skills. And just like Dave earlier was talking about, it's not only those academic skills, but those adaptive skills, those 21st century skills, those soft skills. And when Dr. Walters met with the community, even before we had begun planning, that was one of the things that the employers and the workforce said loud and clear. Like, we need your students that graduate from high school to have all of these skills. We don't necessarily, we can coach them up, but we also need those adaptive skills. So from that work with the strategic planning community, the community came up with profile of a graduate. And I think that's one of the learnings that I would say, if you don't have a profile of a graduate and you want to get engaged in this work, start there, because we had kind of started the work and then we had the profile of a graduate. And I think if we had started with the profile of a graduate, it would have been much easier for us to kind of plan backwards from there. And I feel that more people would kind of see the bigger vision and be able to connect the dots a little bit more. And so these are our profile of a graduate characteristics.
So we started competency-based education. We started in 2016, and when I think back, we actually pretty much did a huge overhaul of the high school, but we took 4 years to do it. So there was a training. The group that's seniors now, they started in the 8th grade, just letting them know what was going to happen and that this was coming their freshman year. So we started with the freshman current class of 2022. They were freshmen. We started with them with their freshman year, and then we followed them until this is the first year that we're wall-to-wall CBE.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know, when we first designed the pilot, we originally were only going to start with one course. Originally, there's a group of us that were all together, including union teachers, colleges and universities in our community. And we said, let's work. I think we picked ELA first. We were just going to do English CBE. And when the group really looked at what was happening with our students and what the community was saying about our students, we figured that if we're going to go all in, we're going to go all in. And so the team agreed to start that first year with all of our core courses. So all of our core courses have been CBE since the very beginning. And then this is the first year that we're wall-to-wall CBE. That means all of our core courses and all of our electives are all competency-based.
Next slide. So one of our challenges is that I always talk about the curse of knowledge. Every parent, every adult, particularly our teachers, are used to the traditional system, and that's what they know. And so one of our challenges was to move from what everyone knew, whether they were an educator or not, everyone understands what school used to look like or should look like, to what we were trying to develop based on the current situation in the world. So the school was created during the first industrial age, and we're now in the fourth industrial age. But if you come into a traditional school system, nothing has changed, and yet the world around education has changed.
And I think, with this work, it is one of the most challenging work that I've ever been involved in. But I always say that the pandemic was our performance test, right? So we had all of these things in place, and then the pandemic happened, and we didn't have a choice anymore, whether we were going to look at learning differently or how teaching and learning was going to be delivered outside of the four classroom walls. And so I always say that, as we're going through this pandemic, what are the things that we learned that worked with the way that students and families and communities look at education now? And this is our chance not to go back to traditional if it wasn't working for some families, some communities, some schools. And so I think that what is great about the vision that Dr. Walters is presenting to us is that there's more choice, there's more agency for students and families.
Next slide.
Sorry, my computer is having a hard time doing that. So let's see. There we go.
And so this just gives you kind of a list of the differences between the beginning of my tenure here in Kankakee to where we are now. And I'll let Felice just kind of go over it in general, just kind of like the highlights of it.
Sure. So again, this work is steeped in equity. And so I think that some of the biggest shifts are our grade book. So our grade book is not owned by a teacher, it's owned by the student. And so just that fact gives the student more agency over their learning. We also looked at our honors classes a little bit differently. So in a traditional setting, you're kind of tracked for these to be in an honors course. In our setting, any student, if you work up to the honors credit, can get that honors credit on their report card at the end of the course. So you don't necessarily have to be in an honors ELA English 9 course to start to get that honors credit. Again, a focus on the learning being the constant rather than the time being the constant. So Dave talked a little bit about extending the time for students to be able to show mastery. So our school year, instead of ending, May 30th, we go all the way until the beginning of the next school year so that students have enough time to develop and master those competencies. I think that making sure that students have more opportunities to reassess and revise and redo assignments is a gift, but it's also one of our biggest barriers. Because I think one of the misnomers with CBE is that there's no time limit, right? Like, oh, students can work at their own pace. They can turn in things whenever they want. Well, no, that's not exactly true because that's not how the real world works. And so we have these ways that you can advocate for yourself if you need to have more time to complete an assignment, or if you need to have some help to revise or redo. But what we are battling is years and years of turning something in and that one and done and then moving on. And so one of our barriers and challenges is how do we kind of develop students with the stamina for that revision, reassess, and redo, as well as making sure that our teachers are giving feedback that helps students to revise, reassess, and redo. Again, oh, go ahead, Doc.
No, I wanted to comment on, I saw a comment in the chat about the honors classes. I just want to give kind of a testimonial to that. I have two children in my house, a sophomore and junior, my nephew and my son. My son is more of a, like his people is, one of my administrators says, you know, the kids find their people in high school. So his people are the athletes, and my nephew, his people are the honor students. And both of them are really bright, but one likes the honors environment, like really likes the honors environment, and one likes the regular environment. So for the first time, and I was actually shocked myself, my son actually earned honors credit in math because of the CBE system and that opportunity. And I was surprised, he was surprised. But then when I talked about going into an honors environment, he said, no, he preferred to be in the classes that he is in now. And so he was able to earn that honors credit without taking him out of an environment that he felt comfortable in.
Yeah, absolutely. And Adrian, I saw your comment too. I'm assuming, were you talking about being engaged in the work for the profile of a graduate?
Yes, we actually called it Profile of a Learner, so that we weren't focused, or it seemed like we were only focusing on who's graduating, but the learning that's taking place starting in kindergarten. So just a little bit of change, but we just finished that and are into strategic planning. So
that's great. Yeah,
yes.
I love that. And one of the, you know, looking at CBE and being innovative, we had gone to a conference through ISB, and Justin Wells from Envision Learning in California, he always said, like, what's the driver's test for that? So you have all these identified characteristics and go back through your curriculum, you know, if you're a unit district starting as early as preschool, and really look at how do you know that students are on their way to be able to do this. One of the other things that we did was we moved from valedictorian salutatorian to the Latin honor system. And that was something that was embraced by everyone really quickly. And so we got to move through that even before we were even engaged in CBE that very first year. That was something that the community welcomed.
Next slide.
So this is just an, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to turn it over to you.
Okay. So this is just an example of, we moved away from credits for graduation to completion of portfolios. And a portfolio is just kind of all of the skills and competencies that are in different subject areas, and they have to fulfill and show mastery or growth in all of those in order to get the credit. Next slide.
So one of the things that I like this quote from Henry Ford, and I've been using this quote since the very beginning, even before competency-based education, but at the beginning of my tenure, first coming in, knowing that I needed to redesign the whole system because I'm also a product of the system. And the reason I like this quote is because I think our struggles are because people are used to horses and they can't imagine a car. And so I always go back to the curse of knowledge. Because people know what school looked like when they were in school, or educators know what school looked like through the time that they've been an educator, changing to this whole different system has been a struggle for a number of people, but I've also seen some huge successes in a lot of students that were not necessarily your students that loved school. And so I think it was important to see that there's an opportunity for all students to become engaged in school, as long as the adults in the system are nurturing that opportunity. So here are our challenges. Like I want to talk about the major challenge that I've seen personally. I'm going to skip down to accountability. It's interesting that adults say, you know, that students don't get to redo things and students have to do things at a certain time. But if you think about your experience in school, we often have adults in the system that don't necessarily do what they're asked to do and don't necessarily turn things in the time that is described because of all kinds of reasons, because of fear, because they don't understand exactly what they're supposed to do. But when you really look deep down into it, it's the same reasons that sometimes students don't follow through on what they're asked to do. And so I say that competency-based education is not unlike the real world. It's very similar to the real world. Lisa, okay.
And again, just really want to leave you with just making sure that you continue to look at change to do what's best for all students and our communities.
And then I just want to end by saying that when you're in a diverse community, the traditional system doesn't work because it doesn't work for every student in every situation. Especially in my mind, I know there was questions early from the state as to why we would go into a different direction when we were struggling with the traditional system. Well, that is exactly why we need to go into the different direction, because the traditional system wasn't working. And the things that we're struggling with now are the exact same things we struggle with in the traditional system, but there's more opportunity to correct or to redirect the students in the CBE system.
Thanks so much to you both. That was really, really helpful and informative. Let's turn to Round Lake Community Unit School District. Dr. Donn Mendoza is superintendent. He's in his 27th year in education and 4th year in this current role. His accomplishments in the district include the comprehensive development and implementation of a plan and strategy, which led to an 18-point increase in the graduation rate, a 60% increase in AP enrollment, implementation of a standards-based approach, and grading and mastery learning throughout the district, implementation of dual language, and the launch of a district-wide visioning process in the area of equity. Dr. Susan Center is the Chief Academic Officer at Round Lake. Her passion for improving the lives of all students by improving educational systems led her to work for change in the schools. Beginning nearly 14 years ago as the high school social studies lead teacher, Susan worked with her lead teacher colleagues and building administrators to begin the innovative improvement journey that would result in increased student achievement and the adoption of a competency-based education in Round Lake schools. She continues that work today. I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Yeah, so Ginger, if you could just go on to the next slide. I'm going to be very brief because I want to pass it off to Susan, who's the architect of our entire competency-based approach. I think just briefly, it's really important to understand who Round Lake is and where we've come. It's really, in my opinion, it's an amazing story. It's my 9th year in the district. And, not many people know that in, the mid 90s, we had the second longest teacher strike in the history of the state. Just 10 years ago, the state relinquished local control back to the local school board. We were on the state under the state finance authority, which those of you that have either known or experienced it, our local school board had no local decision-making authority. There was an oversight board because of the inability to manage the district finances. And frankly, and I say this with some level of humor, we were on all of the academic naughty lists. Prairie State, IGAP, ISAT, we needed to improve. And Genevra said something I just wanted to highlight. I think one of the things, you can see what our demographics are. We've been, for the last 20 years, just rapidly changing community. And the traditional system of education was not working for our kids. It just was not. We weren't doing a good job. I think teachers were working hard, but it just wasn't effective. And since that time, it started by my predecessor, Dr. Collins. We've had labor peace. The board has made significant investments in our academic programming. We've got a very high financial rating. We've got money in the bank. We passed a referendum in 2014 with a 70% approval rating. So we have community support. But I will say, when I came to the district, Susan was one of the first people I met, and she is a graduate of the community. She went to Round Lake high schools and basically started this journey about 13 years ago as a lead teacher, believe it or not. And it really started with this idea of grading and what does a grade mean and how do we assess learning with all of the research that Gusky did out of the University of Kentucky. we started down this path of mastery learning, which basically supports this idea that if given enough time and support, all students can master standards. So I remember her coming to me in 2015 with the 16 when the CBE pilot came and said, we need to do this. It aligns with our current practices. And I fully supported it. So I'm going to pass it off to her to get into the, the detail on it, and just really happy to share our story. So Susan, you're up.
Forgot to unmute. All right. The next couple slides we'll go through fairly quickly because I don't want to sort of belabor the journey, I guess. But we actually began this process, as Donn mentioned, way back in actually 2007. And it started with kind of a look at how, how could we just sort of get better? As Donn mentioned, we had a lot of struggle, a lot of challenges in the district, student academics, student behavior needs. And so we just wanted to improve, period, right? And I think there's something really freeing about the idea that, things aren't going very well kind of generally, because it's kind of like, what do you have to lose? You might as well try something, right? Try something new. And so we kind of grabbed onto that idea. And the first thing we did, which I think is probably looking back, one of the most important things we did was develop a schedule initially at the high school that gave every single teacher 45 minutes of collaboration time every single day. That exists today. It's not common to have that much collaboration time, but we thought we're not going to ever improve if our teachers can't talk to each other. Other professionals talk to each other and talk about how to improve practice, and teachers need to be doing the same. Once we got that, it was a matter of what do we do with the time, right? How do we improve? What does this look like? What should we be talking about? And of course, we can talk about student data, but if we don't have common assessments, if we don't have a common focus, a common way of looking at even our approach to education, then it kind of lacks some of its zing, I guess. It's not as effective. So the lead teacher team, in coordination with the assistant principal and principal, developed a 4-year plan. And the 4-year plan was to start out on this research-based journey of improving curriculum, instruction, and assessment across the board, again, to try to just make adjustments, right? So we started with looking at developing curriculum that was aligned to standards. And mind you, this is just the high school. These are teachers at the high school working in PLCs, developing new curriculum, aligning to standards with the oversight of the building administration. And then we sort of continued that process. So starting with standards alignment, identifying standards, power standards, and then breaking down those standards into what we call indicators, some people call substandards and other things, in order to be able to say, if I'm successful, how do I recognize a student is successful, right? Well, if they can do 1, 2, and 3, or A, B, and C, then that means they're successful with that standard. So that was the initial sort of wave of work that we did. Next, please. Once we developed those standards and indicators, we had to put them into practice. And, the key thing always is student learning, right? What's the point of any curriculum if the kids aren't actually getting it and learning it? So we need to find a way to make sure that we could guarantee learning, right? So, Marzano talks about guaranteed and viable curriculum, but you sort of have to have guaranteed learning, or actually school's not doing its job. So we were very high on the idea of mastery learning, right? So mastery learning is basically what Felice mentioned when she talked about time, right? How much time it takes to learn, and making sure that the time is the thing that's variable and not the learning, right? And in education, that's as crazy as it seems, because everyone hears that and goes, yes, absolutely, kids should learn. But time is always the barrier, right? And people always are willing to bend at time. So we have a historical system of, we have, this unit is 5 weeks. At the end of the unit, take the test, you pass it, good, you don't pass it, oh well, move on, right? And that's the fundamental problem that we needed to change, because if we're saying that this is important curriculum, critical curriculum, then students have to learn it. Like, what's the alternative? If it's not critical, what's it doing in there, right? So you have to make sure that it's working. So mastery learning changed a series of practices in the classroom, where we guaranteed that all students, we had common diagnostic, formative, and summative assessments across the board, making sure that as we went through and taught those things, that each time we took a look at the student results and gave opportunities for reteaching and reassessment from off formatives and off summatives. Now, the formatives we didn't do first because formatives are actually a little bit trickier because they're in progress and you can spiral curriculum in your lesson. We started practicing with those end of unit summatives with reassessment because it got people comfortable with retesting, because the objections that Felice and Dave mentioned, right, of teachers saying, no, why would we do this? And, this isn't how the world works and all that stuff that, those are common things, although it isn't how the world works, as Dr. Walters pointed out. But it made sense to kind of like at these big endpoints, give kids a second chance. And then eventually we were able to work that into formative assessments as well. And then we also built out consistent correctives and enrichment opportunities. So as students who didn't meet proficiency benchmarks on an assessment were needing to retest, other students, they got corrective activities that they were required to do. And the teacher was required to do those in class, like during class time. They couldn't just like assign a packet and then say, see you later. They had to reinvest in instruction, which is critical. And then enrichment activities were given to students who had met proficiency benchmarks on those assessments. Thank you. So once that happened, and I heard Dave mention this, you kind of take a look at and you go, wow, now that we really know how kids are doing, how do we help the kids who are struggling? And the in-class stuff was great, and especially the requirement that teachers reteach and retest in the classroom. But some students are still going to struggle and still going to need more time. So how do you maintain that idea of flexible time to support learning without ultimately, never hitting the end of a curriculum? You can't spend, all of first semester on unit 1. So there has to be a balance. And one of the things that we did was develop outside of the classroom supports, and those have just increased over the years. So from kind of some of the basic things like tutoring and, daytime tutoring, after school tutoring, we now have evening tutoring via Zoom for different, you can log in, they can sign up through Calendly, they can head into a Zoom classroom at night and get support from a certified teacher. We have what we consider sort of like side-by-side kind of classes, which are intersession support classes where students can actually get the same lesson in a different way. And they can do that alongside the work that they're doing and have support there. And then we've built in opportunities for, to demonstrate learning even outside of the semester, perhaps, that they were enrolled in that course in. So that just helps kids to stay focused and gives a bunch of different opportunities for students to be able to demonstrate mastery before finally it's like, no, you didn't pass the class. Now, eventually, there are kids who don't pass classes. That does happen. But we try to make sure that it's not fundamentally not about learning. I mean, if they are absent, 50% of the school days, chances of being successful are not great, but it's not because they didn't have all the support that we could give them. And then we were working through these things when the CBE pilot came out. And I remember sitting at my desk listening to the webinar thinking, we're doing so much of this stuff. We're trying to do so much of this stuff. Why wouldn't we join into this? And so we entered competency-based ed. All right, next, please. So what we're doing now, you'll hear similar things to what Dave and Felice and Dr. Walters mentioned. So we have revised our processes across the board. Now we're a unit district. We actually have our competency-based ed, priority standards, mastery learning, et cetera, all the way through K through 12 now. So we've taken that curriculum and those instructional and assessment practices, and we're doing them from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. So we're super excited about that. This year marks sort of like the final check mark of the last curriculum implementation at the elementary school. So that's been fantastic. We're always want to have flexibility. So we're revised our middle school schedule for additional flexibility. We have assessments that are focused on, as Dave mentioned, the standards that are needed rather than repeating the whole assessment or repeating the whole class. Students just focus on those key standards that they're missing. We have something we like called flexible attendance at our high school level, where students, if they are successful and they're formative and they don't have to attend class the next day for the reteach, which is a huge benefit to a bunch of kids. It's a nice motivator for them. And then one of my favorite things is we built a skills-based curriculum so that our content could be flexible. So it allows us to give students voice and choice in curriculum. So in your English class, you might have a choice of 5 novels, but the instruction is all the same because it's skills-based. And the assessments aren't based on the novel specifically, it's based on what the kids do with the novel. So that's been another thing to allow students to have additional connection to the curriculum. All right, next, please. So what we'll be doing earned honors, as Dave and Felice mentioned, these are kind of a cool idea to allow kids not to have to be sitting in an honors class or to avoid kind of that tracking stigma altogether, to be able to earn honors in any class they're sitting in. We're looking at modifying our schedules. And one of my super exciting hopes for the future is building multi-grade neighborhoods in our elementary schools to support a lot of SEL development and to connect students with older peers to have support as well. All right, last. So what we've learned, I think this has been, this has been a long journey for us since 2007. So, math folks, that's what, like 14 years or so. So just looking at what we've learned over the time, you do see increased student achievement. That's one of the questions that pops up of like, why are you doing this? I don't think people enter into CBE because they're like, I got to improve student achievement. Student achievement is super important, but it's not like always the driver. The driver is more about kids and the connection of kids and how kids feel and how kids feel about school and, making them want to be there. And if you can accomplish those things, then student achievement naturally increases. So the driver is rarely just student achievement, but student achievement is an outcome. So one of the things you'll know is kids who are good at school are often challenged in this new environment because they had school figured out and they feel like somebody pulled the rug out from under them sometimes, and they need to learn a different way to do school. But on the flip side, kids who typically have struggled with school actually re-engage and find new opportunities to feel connected to school. So, you can, both things are great. And the kids who are good at school are going to figure it out. They just get frustrated. Parent communication is a mixed bag because parents are unfamiliar most of the time with what you're trying to accomplish. They never did school that way. So there's kind of maybe a knee-jerk reaction of, I'm not sure about this because I don't recognize it. Staff, same reason, right? They're not sure about this. They did school. They were fine when they were in school. They did it okay. Why can't kids do it the same way still? One of the big things for me is the last one, which is teacher talk matters. So what teachers are saying, especially to their students in explaining the way things need to be done and explaining the mindset and how the class should work in this environment is absolutely critical, because that is the closest way that you're getting connected to kids is through the teacher. And if the teachers explain it, you find out that things go extraordinarily well in the classroom. If teachers are resistant or they don't explain it well, you got a bunch of hiccups and bumps that are going to come along. So teacher talk is absolutely critical. And the last thing I think is to do this for a reason, right? It's not just something to do. You have to have a clear purpose and clear principles. Otherwise you lose people along the way.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I'm capable. We did see a few questions in the chat, and I wonder if anybody wants to take themselves off of mute to speak to it, or I can read them. Adrian asked, do any of the districts that spoke offer support that would be considered interventions, closing large learning gaps that may not be on grade level? Yeah, please.
Yes. So this is Kankakee. I will say that, yes, we offer Twilight Academy, which is interventions and supports in the evening and Saturday school. I will say that we're really struggling with students attending until it gets close to graduation. And then we see more students attending, which is a little disappointing, but I think we have to set up that culture of knowing that you have to provide supports, you have to get support all the time. And then COVID actually hurt us also.
Yep, so we have the same thing. Our interventions, we try to do as much as possible during the day, because that is when we have our students, right, and have access to them. We have an intervention model that we run K-12 where students are identified based on gaps in their learning, and then they're pulled out by either reading specialists or math specialists, and they get worked with during that time. Like I said, we also have these sort of side-by-side self-paced supports for students. And it can be unit-based or course-based that allows, and that's for our older kids, right? Because we don't expect a second grader to be doing a self-paced math lesson. And then we have some additional supports we've built in with teachers to try to build out the frequency of access to tutoring during the day. And we try not to always reflect it as tutoring, right? But we want to look at it as support for kids during which they get help with math or English or science.
Yeah.
Very similar to Round Lake, we have interventions in our middle school we do have pull-out, but we also have structured courses that kids can take in math or reading, and similar thing in high school. So very similar to what Round Lake has.
Great, thanks. We've got just a few minutes here. I know two things I was hoping, Felice, you'd say something about your CBE ambassadors, and then John, if you'd say something about the flexibility before everybody leaves. So Felice, do you want to say something quickly about the CBE ambassadors?
Sure. Like Susan was talking about, communication is so important. Like, how is the message being delivered? So Dr. Walters had an idea of having CBE ambassadors. So it was students and families that really kind of believed and saw a difference in the CBE process and were willing to kind of be trained up and to go out into the community or talk to other parents, or if we had workshops, kind of to speak on behalf of explaining CBE processes.
Great, thanks. And then John, give us a pitch.
Great. Thanks, Ginger. So yeah, those are really great practices, I think, in stories all the community share. We also appreciate your honesty about some of your successes and challenges of this work. I mean, I often hear on the state that, well, you know, we really wish the State Board of Ed would open up the competency-based ed pilot again so we could do this work. And we also want the CBE pilot to be renewed, but you don't need the pilot to do this work. That was the dirty secret of the pilot all along the PWR Act. Like, you can do this under the current school code and administrative rules, and there's flexibility to navigate through that, to undertake all the practices that were talked about today. So if there are things that you heard about that you think that could be implemented locally, like I said, you don't need the State Board of Ed's blessing to do that. There's enough flexibility in our current law to try to undertake these practices.
Thanks, John. And thanks to everybody who came, and especially to our presenters. I really appreciate your honesty and your willingness to share your journeys with us. And I know we'll be in touch to hear more about how things are going. Thanks so much. Everybody have a great day.